everyone, my name is Leah and today we will be making a cloak, and specifically a Wirt from Over the Garden Wall cloak, but you can make cloaks for anything, for the winter, for cosplay, or even for Christmas gifts this season. So let's get started. So first up for me is always pattern making, and I originally wanted to do like a circle skirt that sits on your shoulders basically, but I wasn't able to do that because the fabric was going to be too short, so I had to cut the circle skirt into quarters, and then from there I made a pattern, and it was going to be a half pattern, so I was going to have to sew two halves of it together. Here I'm just extending it to make it full body length, and then making some adjustments because my paper still wasn't big enough after taping two of them together, so I'm just tracing it and extending it. Right here, I'm making adjustments to the neckline because, like I said, it started off as a quarter circle skirt, so the top part wasn't big enough. So I was tracing and cutting and making sure that it was going to be big enough to sit perfectly around the neck. I know I keep saying circle skirt, that's just because it's the shape. We're still making a cloak, I promise. So here I threw my mock-up of the pattern onto the mannequin just to see how it sits, and the collar wasn't sitting right, so I'm trimming off a bunch there. And the other thing is that the shoulders weren't sitting right. So I basically cut off a big chunk of the shoulder, and I'm going to re-sew that triangle together. And hopefully it sits a lot better on the shoulder and it forms really nicely around the shoulder. I don't know why, this part of the process is just really fun for me, making all the cuts and kind of figuring out the puzzle of the pattern. So I really enjoyed this part. Now this fabric is my new and improved pattern that I'm going to use to make a mock-up, and the shape ended up being like this. So here I am making the mock-up out of more scrap fabric that I had. There's not a lot of sewing involved. It's pretty much just the shoulder seams and then the big seam down the back. And that's pretty much it. So the actual sewing didn't take very long at all. And here's the whole mock-up put together. I was really liking how it was turning out. I loved how the shoulders seams laid on the actual shoulders, and I was pretty happy with it. The only thing is that it needed a collar, so here I am having to measure to make sure that it was gonna fit. It was just a mock-up, so I wasn't too worried about it. It wasn't too tedious. And now comes the scary part, cutting into the real fabric and making the real thing. So here I am using that fabric pattern that I made earlier, tracing it onto the real fabric. I'm using flannel here. Wool would have been very expensive, and I think flannel is very warm and I like the way it drapes most of the time. It's also very easy to work with. I also had my collar traced out. I didn't use any sort of pattern, I just traced a rectangle with the right measurements. And I wanted to throw in a little hidden pocket, so I'm measuring out the square here. The pocket did cause me a lot of trouble, but it was worth it. I ended up having to hand sew it in the end, but it's okay. Here I am doing that little bit of sewing on the shoulder seam. I had to do this for both the outer and inner layer, of course. The layers are both made out of flannel, and I really like how it added to the weight of the cloak in the end, because I really wanted it to have that heavy feel to it. Now, of course, I had to pin everything beforehand. I had to make sure that everything lined up. I was actually really worried that it wasn't going to be lined up, but it ended up working out in the end, so I was very happy. I'm glad I took the time to pin everything. It made things so much easier when it came to the actual sewing part. I don't know why, it looks kind of scary with all the pins in it, but I basically used all of my pins to make sure everything was in place because I didn't want anything sliding around when I was trying to sew it all together. I have a really bad habit of sewing over my pins and also just having my needles break on me, so I was wearing these glasses in case something broke and flew into my eye. I would at least have some protection. Alright, so I just sewed the two layers together. Here it is. I sewed around the collar, the front part, and along the bottom here, except I left an opening down here so I could flip it inside out. But it feels so nice and heavy. Like, I didn't think flannel was gonna feel this heavy, but I guess the double layer of it does. And I feel like it's draping so nicely. I'm so excited. Here I am flipping it inside out. I'm always a little scared of flipping things inside out because I'm worried a random seam is gonna rip, but everything was okay. I found a loose thread, and I forgot I had to clip the corners before I did anything or before I flipped it all the way inside out, just to make sure that the corners came out pointy. And then I put fray check on the end because it felt a little too close to the seam for my liking, and I didn't want the flannel to fray all the way through the seam and cause a hole, so I had to put it on there. Ignore these bad angles of me, please. The problem I feared has come to fruition. So I have to sew the collar to the neckline, and it's like I thought, too thick. So I decided that I would whip stitch it, which I've never done, but I looked up tutorials, so I think it's okay. So I'll whip stitch it together and maybe do a back stitch underneath to like reinforce it. We'll see how it goes. If it doesn't work, I can always just seam rip it, and that's the great thing about sewing. This is me doing the whip stitch that I just learned, and I realized after I finished this project that I totally meant a blanket stitch, and that's what I was supposed to be looking up, and that's what I had in my head. I just didn't know what it was called, and so I looked up whip stitch, which probably explains why this wasn't working. So yeah, wrong stitch, and all of that I just did was basically for nothing. So fun. Anyways, I got the collar attached with a back stitch. It was a little long, so I had to do a very scary thing and cut off the excess. It ended up being okay. It was all good. Don't worry. I just love how you can see the hesitation in the way I'm cutting, in my face, in everything. I was very excited to attach the buttons. I have it all marked out here, had my buttons ready. I love the buttons, I just wish they were a tiny bit bigger. I just couldn't find enough of the bigger ones. And you would think attaching buttons is pretty boring, but I found it very relaxing. I was kind of used to the hand sewing after doing that whole collar and everything, so it was pretty nice. It was a nice break from everything else. And finally, we have the finished product. I was very happy with this project. I enjoyed the process aside from the pocket situation. But yeah, my friend really liked it, so I was very happy. Thank you guys for watching, and let me know what you thought of everything.